The 1920s and 1930s were key decades in American history. During the 1920s, we saw the rise of a consumer society, while in the 1930s we saw the unfortunate effects of the previous decade's consumeristic ways. Although the cultures of these decades are distinctly different, they are also very much related. The culture of the 1920s was defined by consumerism. People found that they had more money and more things to spend this money on than they did during the war. Many Americans paid with credit and used installment buying. Companies spent billions on advertising. Homes began to see a variety of new appliances like colorful refrigerators and washing machines, which were made possible by electricity. The radio replaced the fireplace as the center of the home, which families would gather around every night. More and more Americans also owned cars. However, one thing Americans were not allowed to own in this time period was alcohol. Prohibition was a major concern of the 1920s. Despite the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol, many Americans continued to drink illegally, making bathtub gin in their homes or drinking at speakeasies supplied by famous gang members, like Al Capone.
Famous people were certainly at the center of attention in the 1920s with the developing movie industry. Actors Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino were seen as heroes. Sports had its heroes as well, with baseball player Babe Ruth and boxer Jack Dempsey. Millions of Americans attended all kinds of sporting events in the 1920s, but perhaps the most important hero of the decade was Charles Lindbergh, who was the first to fly successfully across the Atlantic Ocean, receiving an enormous and enthusiastic welcome home from the American people.
The arts also developed greatly during this decade. Music saw the creation of a new genre, jazz, which was played by musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Many came to see musicians like these perform at venues like the Cotton Club. In literature, many criticized the consumerism and conformity of the decade, and these writers, along with their works, came to be known as the Lost Generation. This included Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, and many others. The Harlem Renaissance also helped to develop the arts, celebrating the new Negro, where black intellectuals and artists celebrated black culture. The movement was launched by the 1921 musical comedy Shuffle Along and included poet Langston Hughes and essayist Alan Locke. Art was also important in this decade, with artists like Edward Hopper, Georgia O'Keeffe, and musician George Gershwin.
In the 1920s, religion began to have a greater influence in America. The nation found itself caught up in the Scopes trial on religion, which pitted fundamentalists like William Jennings Bryan against modernists. This was a part of a greater religious revivalism that swept the nation in this time period, with notable leaders such as Aimee Semple McPherson, Billy Sunday, and Father Divine. The rival of religious revivalism seemed to be science. Many modernists supported John Thomas Scopes and Darwin's theory of evolution. There were also many important advances in science, including Robert Goddard's rocket experiments, TV signal, penicillin, insulin, vitamin D, and the X-ray.
The 1920s also saw an increase in the fight for rights. A new group of blacks advocating black separatism rallied behind leader Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Women also fought for their rights, embracing a flapper style and the new woman, as well as passing the 19th Amendment and entering the workforce. With the women's fight for rights came a sexual revolution. The revolution circulated around an increase in casual dating and Margaret Sanger's birth control movement. In the 1930s, the consumeristic ways that had prevailed in the 1920s came to a halt, all beginning with the stock market crash of October 1929, which, combined with many other elements, catapulted the nation into a Great Depression.
Mass media and popular culture were very prevalent in the 1930s. Almost every American owned a radio in this time period, listening with hope to President Roosevelt's fireside chats as the Great Depression continued. The radio also allowed everyone to listen to the same form of entertainment, from soap operas to sports, creating a homogeneous mass culture. Millions flocked to the movies each week as a form of escapism, and the film industry began following new codes for censoring vulgar material. During the Great Depression, more youth lost their jobs, causing them to stay in high school instead, thus fostering a greater spread of youth culture.
The women's rights movement that had been prospering in the 20s now reached a new low point in the 1930s. Working married women were looked down upon during the Great Depression, but at the same time, the nation saw an increase in working women, mostly out of economic necessity. Family life was also affected by the Great Depression with a decrease in marriage and birth rates and increase in divorce rates. Many returned to traditional skills, and the psychological effects of the Great Depression would last a lifetime.